Welcome to part 13 of making browser games in JavaScript, and today I wanted to talk about how we can modify the CSS of different HTML tags without actually using CSS, with using JavaScript. And the application of this video is going to be very important for the next game project which we're going to do. So I deleted all the rock, paper, scissors code. I no longer need this title. I'll just call it web series. And what I want to do, I'm going to create a very simple site here. I'm just going to call my h1 title. So I'm creating an h1 tag, and then I'm going to create a paragraph tag, description /p. So I just created an h1 tag and a paragraph tag here. And so previously, we changed the CSS, or we changed the style of these tags by adding CSS inside of the left tag, or the opening tag, and we typed style equals, and then in quotation marks we would do all kinds of things like color red and other styles like that. And that would of course modify the font color here. But what I want to show is how to do the same thing in JavaScript plus a little bit more. So what we're going to do is I'm going to delete this. We're going to change the colors and styles of these tags, but without adding stuff here. We're going to do it differently, and we're going to use JavaScript for it. So first thing we need to do, and this will make sense later, I'm going to give an ID for this h1 tag. So after the h1, but before my closing angle bracket, I'm going to type ID equals, and we're going to have two quotation marks, and inside of those quotation marks, I'm going to type title. And that is going to be the ID of this h1 tag. And we're going to need that in a second. Now, in JavaScript, I can actually create a variable that represents this tag. I can type, I'm just going to call it my title, var my title is equal to, and here, to set this variable equal to this tag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type document, wow, I think I misspelled it, document, no I didn't, .get element by ID, two parentheses, and inside of the parentheses, we type the ID of whichever tag we are trying to access. So I'm trying to create a variable that represents this tag, so I'm going to use the title ID. I'm going to type title in here. So I just created a variable in JavaScript that represents my HTML. Document is this whole document, and then .getElementById is a function that will return an element when you give it a certain ID. But to prove that we have the same one, you can just log console.log my title, and watch what happens here. I'm going to refresh the page, and inside the console we have the exact HTML code that was here before. And you can see they're exactly the same. Line 13 is exactly the same as what we have here. And that's really powerful to use in JavaScript. But there's more we can do besides just logging it. You can actually change the word title to a different word. So I want you to think of it like this. The h1 ID and then the closing h1 tag, that is your outer HTML. And this is your inner HTML. It's your code or your words that you put in between your opening and closing h1 tags. And the reason I explain that is because you can say my title dot inner HTML equals and change it to a completely different word. Better title. Inner HTML represents whatever's in the middle here, this text here. It is not either one of these sides, it's in the middle. So by typing my title dot inner HTML and then setting it equal to a new word, I just changed this title here without actually modifying the HTML. The HTML still says that the title should be title. but the JavaScript changed it to better title. And now let's actually still log the title, because when I refresh this, you can see that better title is the inner HTML now, and it successfully modified it. There's more things you can do. Now let's move on to the CSS. I can type my title dot style, that refers to its CSS. CSS is just styling. My title dot style dot, and this is a little bit more complicated. You can't just type dot style and then, add stuff. You need to specify what CSS attribute you're modifying. So let's start with the color, the font color. Remember from the last or a previous video that to change the font color, I would type style equals color colon red, like that. And then I would separate it with a semicolon if there were more CSS rules to follow. That's how I would do it in the HTML, but in the JavaScript, I'm going to do something really similar. My title dot style dot color, so this matches this, and then I'm going to set it equal to the word red, exactly as it appears here. When I do that, refresh, not only does the color change, but look, the tag here changes as well. Oh, actually, let me delete this. Let me delete this so you know it's actually coming from the JavaScript. All right, refresh. And look, the tag has an ID, and then style equals color red. But we didn't add that. The HTML only has the title. But the JavaScript that we added the style attribute inside the h1 tag. And you can change more styles. You can basically do anything with CSS you can do from JavaScript. So I'm going to type dot style and then dot. I'm going to do background. Now remember, background color was background dash color. That's how it appeared over here. We would do style equals background dash color red, which is a bad background. Let's make it cyan. But in JavaScript, dashes are not allowed to separate words. So this is where your CSS thing here and your JavaScript here are going to be a little bit different. Dashes are not allowed in JavaScript, so instead it's a capital C. And that rule is the same for all other CSS attributes. If you have a CSS attribute that has a dash, the JavaScript equivalent is going to be all one word, but the second word's going to have a capital letter there. So background color with a dash is what you put in your HTML. Background color, all one word, is what you put in your JavaScript. And I'm going to set this to cyan and delete this so that you know it's not coming from the HTML. Refresh the page, and I made a mistake. What did I do? Oh, I accidentally deleted too much. There we go. Needs to be a space. And look, the JavaScript keeps modifying the tag here. We have the ID, which we made, but added the color red, background color cyan. And look, JavaScript knows what you mean. When you put background color as one word, it knows to put background dash color here. And it's really fun to use. Now let me show one last trick before we do something cooler with this. I want to make the colors change every second, and I'm going to show you how to do that at the end of the video, but let me show you one more thing. You can also change the size of this text here. So recall, in the CSS or the HTML, it would be style equals font dash size colon, and then 30 px for pixels. Now here is the JavaScript equivalent. My title dot style dot font size, one word with a capital letter for the second word, equals 30px. Like that, and let's see if it gets any bigger. It actually got smaller. Maybe by default the h1 was less than 30 pixels. So let's make this 40. I want to see it get bigger. There we go. And it does the exact same thing here. Font dash size, we replace with font size here. And so that's how you change the size, the background color, the red. Anything that you can do here, you can also do here in the JavaScript. And really, I wouldn't recommend doing this in the JavaScript if you know it's going to be permanent. If we know that the H1 background color is always going to be cyan, it'd be a better idea to just type that in here. The reason that we're using JavaScript is JavaScript would let us change the CSS mid runtime, I guess. While the website is running, we can make changes. And that's what we're about to do. So I'm going to delete all this other stuff we don't need. I'm just going to change the background color. So here for the stuff that stays permanent, I want the color to be red, and that's it. Color will be red. But I'm going to delete all this stuff except the background color. Like that, save, refresh, and it goes back to title since we modified that in the JavaScript. And I don't need to log my title anymore. So what I want to make is I want to make this refresh. I want the color to change every second or so. We'll do it every second. And again, that's why you use JavaScript. JavaScript would allow us to change the color every second. This code, this HTML code, would not let us do that. All right, so now here's how you do that. There is a handy function that will let you delay code execution. So what we're going to do is we need to have code to set the title to be cyan, then magenta, then yellow, but we need to delay that code's execution so that it's cyan 1 second, then magenta the next, then yellow. But let's actually see that out. Here's a function, set timeout. This is a function, and it takes two parameters. The first one is the code that you want to run. The second one is the amount of time you wait before that code runs. So actually the first parameter is a function. So let's create a function. I don't want the background color to change until 3 seconds have gone by. So I'm going to make a function, change color. And inside change color, I'm going to put this code here. Which of course means that now this will not turn cyan, but we're about to change that. So set timeout takes two arguments. The first one is a function that I want to run after a delay. And notice when I'm using a function as an argument, I don't use the parentheses. Because if I use the parentheses, I'm telling JavaScript to execute that function. I don't want to execute it immediately. Instead, I want JavaScript to simply make note of this function. And hence, I'm using it as an argument here. So set timeout, this is the function we want to run, and I want to run it after 3 seconds have gone by. So 3 seconds is the same as 3,000 milliseconds. And now let's run and see what happens. 2, 3, and it changes the color after 3 seconds. Set timeout takes as a function the code you want to run and the time delay before it happens. So here's what we can do. If we want this color to change many, many times, I'm going to change this function name to cyan. And actually, let me make one final note before I do. You can actually, if you don't want to create a whole function just for set timeout, you can create a temporary function that would be destroyed as soon as set timeout ends. So instead of making a change color function, what I can do is I can actually create a function inside of the set timeout parentheses, the opening parentheses here, closing one is here. And so notice I just created a function, but I didn't give it a name. I just gave it parentheses. This means I'm using a temporary function. This function is going to be destroyed as soon as this line of code executes, and it will never be used again. So if you have a bunch of one-time use functions, this would be a good time to simply type function, no name, just parentheses, but the curly brackets stay the same. And just in case you're confused about what you're looking at, again, the set timeout had two parentheses. Its opening one is here, its closing one is here. Function has two curly brackets, one is here, and the other is here. Well, let's run that. It's going to work the exact same way. And boom, it changed colors, even though we didn't use a change color. So I just wanted to note that. But we're actually going to name the functions here. So I'm going to call this cyan. This is going to be my cyan function. I'm going to copy and paste, and I'm going to make the yellow function, which will change the background color to yellow, and the magenta function, which will change the background color to magenta. So here's what we're going to do. I want this order. So we're going to call the set timeout function. We're going to call the cyan function after 1 second, or 1,000 milliseconds. We're going to call the yellow function after 2 seconds. And we're going to call the magenta function after 3 seconds. Now notice this does not mean that it's going to wait 1 second and then the background will be cyan, then it will wait 2 more seconds and then it will be yellow, then it'll wait 3 seconds and it'll be magenta. That's not how this works. The code is going to wait 1 second for cyan, then the next second it's going to be yellow, then the next second it is going to be magenta. Since basically you can think of all of these as starting at the same time. So cyan executes first just because it waits the least amount of time, then yellow, then magenta. So what this is not is it is not yellow after 2 seconds, magenta after 3 more seconds. It's cyan 1 second, yellow 1 second, magenta 1 second. Let's run that. So it changes to cyan, yellow, and magenta. Let's run it again so you can see it. And now what you can do is we can make this last a little bit longer. What I'm going to do is set a time variable, var time, and I'm going to start it as 1,000 seconds. And so now I'm going to set the delay to time. But if I set all 3 to time, that means all 3 of these functions would try to execute at the same time after just 1,000 seconds. Let's see what happens. And they all tried to execute at the same time, but since magenta was the last one, it's the one that prevailed here. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use a time variable, but after every set timeout function, we're going to add another 1,000 to time. So that way, we're doing basically the same thing as we were before, but we're using a time variable, and I'm going to increase time even after. So now the first time will be 1,000, then it will be 2,000, then it will be 3,000, cyan, then a second later yellow, then a second later magenta. So we're going to get the same result as we did last time, but what's cooler about this is now I can copy and paste it, and I can have this run repeatedly. So it's going to now alternate between those many different colors. And actually, it looked like it stopped. Why did it stop? Cyan, yellow, magenta, cyan, yellow, magenta, cyan, yellow, magenta. Oh, because I didn't save. I can tell from Notepad++ it's not saved because the file icon is red. So now let me save it and run it. And now the colors are going to keep going. And that's all I had planned for this video. Thank you so much for watching. And the document.getElementById is a really important function that we're going to be making a lot more use of in our next project.